Okay, and we're live. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another Science After Dark with the MSU Science Festival. My name's Catherine. I'm joined by Roxanne Troon from the Science Festival as well. And tonight we're also joined by Dr. Andrew Vanderjagt and Lee Sprengler. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Awesome. Thanks, Catherine. Pleasure to be here. With everything going on, I think this is a welcome distraction from it all. I do know that a great philosopher, Thomas Rhett, once said, there ain't nothing a beer can't fix. And with that, let's get rolling. However, Thomas Rhett I'm not exactly a fan. My motto is a little bit more like, there ain't nothing a drip torch can't fix. And so I think that tonight we're going to explore a little bit about fire ecology and how burning forests can actually save forests, and do that in both Eastern and Western United States. So I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce my co-host, an undergraduate MSU student in forestry, Lee Sprengler. Lee, say hi to everyone. You are muted.
Hi, everybody. Might have to slow down on these, maybe.
Maybe a little bit. At least so you can operate the space bar.
All right, it's my first one.
Awesome. All right. So yeah, a little bit more about us. Again, my name is Dr. Andy Vanderjagt. I'm a research specialist in the forestry department at Michigan State. I got my master's and PhD degree at the University of Tennessee, go Vols. And my BS in biology from Hope College, go Dutch. And yes, I am originally from Michigan. So this is my grandfather here, who actually started the fire department in Port Sheldon, Michigan. And my father succeeded him and was chief for I think around 25 years. He's probably gonna yell at me for not knowing the exact number. But yeah, there he is. And this is actually my brother, who made our family legacy extremely proud by becoming a firefighter himself. And then something went terribly, terribly wrong. And I started lighting the woods on fire, and my dad had no idea why. Joining me is Lee Sprengler, who is a forestry student from Michigan State University, as I said, from Holly, Michigan. And then I'll have one more thing and turn it over to him. I invited him because I do believe he is the perfect After Dark host. I know this for a variety of reasons, having taught him in some of my courses. But yes, I think he'll be an excellent choice to join us tonight and to entertain us. So Lee, do you have anything else you'd like to say at this moment?
Oh, not a whole lot. I appreciate your vote of confidence there. I was curious. I kept looking at that picture in the presentation. I was like, man, how could he have ever been that blonde? Because I thought it was you.
Nope, that would be you. And I'll also mention that Lee had skipped one of my classes, and that's why he was forced into this situation. So, well, I'm just kidding. Lee was an awesome undergrad in my course, and so I'm glad to have him today, and I think he'll make a welcome addition. So with that, I'd like to lay out where we're headed today. I'd like to provide you a little bit of historical context first, then we'll dive into the modern repercussions of that history. And so bear with us as we go through some science here. We are going to then get into a nice little game show that I think will be really fun. So hopefully you can hang on into that portion of the show. And then we'll talk about some potential solutions and barriers to change to fire management as it currently is. And then talk about the future of fire management in the United States. So these are my baby girls. I put them up for a couple of reasons. One, as we are all dealing with these days of staying home and staying safe, I have had quite enough of them, even as cute as they are. And if you hear something screaming, it's probably them. But two, they are doing what I would like everyone to do right now, and that is not fall asleep, but close your eyes. All right? Now, I can't see you, but I would like you to not cheat, and I would like you to close your eyes. Imagine that you're in that first wave of European settlement to the North American continent. You arrive on the eastern coast, get off the ship that carried you across the Atlantic Ocean, and you've realized that, hey, I'm gonna set out on my version of the American dream, head to the frontier, which at that time is probably the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and make a claim for myself and establish a homestead and make it in this new world. So you head out, you hike, you bring everything that you need for that journey, and you get to the top of the Appalachian Mountains, and you look out in front of you. You're looking out across that landscape, and I want you to just imagine what that would look like. You know, what do you see? Lee, would you like to add anything to that narrative, that this imaginary quest?
No, nothing I can. I mean, just it takes a lot of imagination, but it might not take quite as much imagination as most people think.
Yeah.
It's worth noting that Native Americans had been using prescribed fire, you know, a good deal of the time, well before the settlers ever got here. So that's worth noting.
Well, and you just done ruined everybody's imagination, because, all right, you can open your eyes. I would imagine that everyone was picturing this before Lee gone and spoiled it all with his little Native Americans were burning everything. Most people,
everything.
Closed canopy forest stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and that a squirrel could climb from treetop to treetop that entire distance. And we are here to tell you tonight that that was probably not accurate. That's actually a myth, and we know this for a variety of reasons. Fire had been influencing ecological communities in North America for around 500 million years, since the Silurian. And we know this, we can look at what the earlier settlers actually saw and what they wrote down in descriptions. We can look at cores from depositional environments like wetlands, and look at the pollen that is layered in those deposits, and look at the types of plant communities that would have existed. And that shows, you know, dominance of grass and kind of open environment loving tree species. We can also look at charcoal deposits in soils and wetlands and see a lot of it, indicating a lot of fire was present. And then also tree rings. So trees put on an annual growth ring every single year. And when a fire happens, you can actually kill a portion of that actively growing layer. And then subsequent years will start to grow around that scar. And so that actually provides a record of that fire scar. And I actually have one here. So if you look at, you know, my little inset screen, you can see one of those in real life. So in this growth ring here, there was a fire and it killed it. And then now this tree is starting to grow over it and starting to heal itself. And eventually this will grow in like some of these here in the interior part of the tree. And so these were, you know, fire scars that happened in subsequent years, you know, back into time. And I think actually there's 13 different fire scars in this one tree, and it's not that big of a tree. So yeah, pretty interesting. And if we take all of this evidence and put it together, we can actually generate fire return interval maps for the entire United States. And so you can see from this map here, the warm colors indicate fire happening almost every other year at the darkest of red, all the way up to only occurring around every 6,000 years. And so if you look at this map, I think a lot of you would be surprised relative, you know, comparing the Eastern United States to the Western United States. And when you think about that relationship that you probably had in your mind with fire, and that a lot more common in the Eastern United States than you might think. So there are these lines of evidence of fire occurring, kind of like that, you know, in different ways that we know that fire was occurring. But I think the greater evidence comes in the form of the fire-dependent vegetation communities that we know existed. So most people depict this as kind of this transitional zone along the prairies of the West and the forests of the East. And so we have these savannas, and fire was important in maintaining those. Right here in Michigan, we had examples of those communities. And so here's a quote from Van Buren County in 1884, where it basically says that annual fires burnt up the underwood in the oak openings, leaving them clear of obstructions, so clear that you could drive a wagon wherever you pleased through the woods. And the woods certainly don't look like that today. But I'm also here to say that a lot of this, this transition between the forests of the East and the prairies of the West is kind of a misnomer, because we also had longleaf pine savannas that dominated the coastal plain and were these open, fire-maintained savannas, much like the savannas you'd see in Africa. We had eastern savannas and woodlands that were, interior and in the Piedmont Valley. We also had Appalachian mountain balds, these grasslands that were maintained on tops of mountains. And then here in northern Michigan, jack pine barrens also. So we punched a lot of holes into what you might have thought was closed canopy forest across much of the eastern United States here. And really what was doing this was fire. So in the eastern United States, we get enough moisture to sustain closed canopy forests, but it was fire that inserted these unique open communities into that what otherwise would be closed canopy forest. And so you can see that. Here's a map of the precipitation patterns across the eastern United States, and maybe this is probably what you were thinking the fire map would look like. There's some misconceptions there. And really what this all boils down to is succession. So in the absence of fire, eventually a prairie becomes a savanna, becomes a woodland, becomes a forest, because trees grow, they modify the environment, and pretty soon shade out grasses and wildflowers, and more trees grow, and then the species composition of those trees changes, and eventually we get this closed canopy forest that sustains itself. But fire can actually set back succession to some of these earlier points within that successional gradient. So we had evidence of the direct evidence of fire. We had some greater evidence of these vegetation communities that wouldn't have existed without that fire. But then perhaps even the greatest evidence would be the species that existed here in the eastern United States. And since we are from the forestry department, I'm gonna kind of dive into some of the trees. So within those longleaf pine savannas on the coastal plain, longleaf pine has this really cool grass stage. So if you're walking along and you encounter it when it's very, very young and as a seedling, you might not even recognize it as a tree because it just looks like this little tuft of grass. And really what that does is it provides this really tight, compact layer of needles around the apical meristem. This is where trees grow from. They grow from this end bud. And so when a fire occurs, it burns, but it can't burn through all those tightly compact needles. It burns the outside layer, but it doesn't actually hurt the growing portion of the tree. And so over time, that tree can build a ton of resources below ground and then get into what is called the rocket stage here that's depicted, and shoot up and grow so rapidly that it then escapes the influence of that fire and can survive subsequent fires. Moving a little further north, we have our oak trees that really devote a lot of their growth to their roots over their shoots. And then they readily resprout after fire and also have thick bark that provides some thermal insulation for those trees. And then even further north here in Michigan, we have the jack pine, which had serotinous cones. And these cones actually open when they are exposed to a heat signal, which allows their seeds to go out right after a fire, which is the perfect time for them to grow in an environment that has been blackened and charred and just ready for their seedlings to germinate. So it's pretty cool. The entire reproductive strategy of this tree is tied to fire. And then, yes, we like our trees in the forestry department, but we can also jump into wildlife and talk about how bison once roamed the eastern United States. And if you know a little bit about bison, they're obligate gramnivores and need grass. And so that tells you something about what the eastern United States looked like. Also prairie chickens, and their name is not a misnomer. They loved open grasslands. And Audubon once wrote that in Kentucky, that no good hunter of Kentucky would deign to shoot a prairie chicken because they were just trash birds. They were everywhere. And now they've been extirpated almost completely from the Eastern United States.
Pigeons of the prairie, if you will.
Pigeons of the prairie. Yes, sir. So if we stopped here, that would be a nice little planet Earth story, right? We could set up a film crew and have old David Attenborough record it. But unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. So what once was this open, sun-rich environment with an incredibly diverse layer of grasses and forbs, wildflowers, butterflies flitting around everywhere, just a scene straight out of a Disney movie, slowly became darker, wetter, and turned into the forest that we know today. And there was one person who was responsible more than any other. And that is this person. And I'm sure you've all seen him. I'm not a big fan of him. And if you don't know that by the end of this, you weren't paying attention, or you had a few too many of those drinks Lee's sipping on over there. So the result of Smokey the Bear's influence in the Eastern United States can be summed up in this one big giant word. And this is the word that you can walk away from this presentation and really impress people with: mesophication. This describes that process which that photo transition just showed, where things get darker, wetter, and just completely change as succession occurs, and more fire sensitive, shade loving, wet, moisture loving species take over and really just change the whole forest system. And so you can see that kind of depicted here as those transitions change, and we go from the savannas of old that were maintained by fire to these strange, dark, wet forests that we have today. And so this has had consequences. So I'm going to give you 4 of them. Number 1, the loss of those disturbance-dependent ecological communities. 2, drastic changes in forest composition. So you can see here from this graph, this basically just shows across the bottom size classes of trees. So as you get bigger in trees, you have this equal distribution between oaks and maples. But when you look at the smaller size classes, which we can represent as the forests of tomorrow, they are completely dominated by shade tolerant, so shade loving maples. They also love moisture. And so in the future, our forests are going to drastically change. Also, what once was this lush herbaceous layer has become a biological desert of leaf litter. I say that a little bit jokingly, but yes, very few of those grasses and forbs remain. And then finally, this has also had consequences for disturbance-dependent wildlife. So if we look into trends for birds specifically, we see that the greatest negative decline in habitat guilds across bird species has been in our grassland species. These are birds that depend on those open lands and these fire maintained systems. And so we can see that here with these grasslands being the biggest decline. And in Michigan, we have 2 really good examples of this. They once both were endangered, but now actually the Kirtland's warbler has just recently been delisted. But it's still, a pretty rare species because it depends on those jack pines and young jack pines. And so without fire, they don't have those young jack pines because remember, the jack pine needs that fire to open its cone. And then also these Carner blue butterflies, which is a federally endangered species that depends on oak savannas, and a species of lupin in the understory that its caterpillars require to eat. So yeah, those 2 species kind of signify this loss of those grasslands in the fact that they're rare and once were endangered or still are endangered. But I also want to make a point here that if we dive into our forest bird species, we see, kind of this decline, and some of them are not doing well, but some of them are doing well. And if we really tear apart all of those forest trends in our forest birds, what we see is the ones that aren't doing well, like the cerulean warbler, really depend on a tattered canopy. So just a slight disturbance. So they are classified as forest birds, but they need like a canopy gap or something nearby. And so without fire, without disturbance in these forested systems, they're the ones that are in trouble. So they're the ones that are driving those negative declines. All right, so from all of that legacy of fire on our landscape, we get to this. This is representative of that legacy and what fire did to that landscape. And you can see that, some places of those forests would have repeatedly escaped fires, places along rivers or, on northeastern facing slopes that were just, didn't receive a lot of sun and therefore were less flammable. They would have escaped multiple fires and became forests, but other places would have been burned repeatedly year after year after year and turned into prairie. And so we can see all of the different diversity of things that fire could have inserted. Sometimes a fire would have occurred and created, been really intense and killed all the trees, but then we have all these young trees that are coming back and resprouting. We have a new forest that's going to be growing up in its place. And so we have that on the landscape. And, we have all of this variety of forest structure and species that could be attributed to fire. And so with that, we are going to play a little game called, I hope most of you are familiar with the game called Whose Line Is It Anyway? But instead of that, we are going to play Whose Niche Is It Anyway? And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Lee to explain the rules of our game. And yeah, grab myself a drink.
Good evening, everybody, particularly Roxanne and Catherine. I'd like to welcome you lovely ladies to a nice little game of Whose Niche Is It Anyway. I'd also like to point out that for those of you who are big Scrabble fans, mesophication, triple word score, instant win. You're pretty much done. You can walk away at that point. If you can find the letters for it. So the way this game is going to be played is some of the species that Andy has mentioned and some of the ones that Andy hasn't mentioned are going to have little descriptions, and the two of you are going to try and guess which niche or niche they belong on the progression of forest progression. So basically, and of course there will be no points awarded. There are, however, rewards, and that being the ability to drink a little bit faster than you might have ordinarily drank if you get it right. Or if you get it wrong, it really doesn't matter, just like the points and Whose Line Is It Anyway. With that.
And I will also add that, yes, Roxanne and Catherine are our contestants here that we can actually interact with, but everybody at home should be interacting as well.
Absolutely.
Yes, before Roxanne and Catherine get it. They're pretty smart, so you'll have to act quick.
All right, ladies, are you ready?
I'm ready.
I'm
All
ready.
right.
Ready as we'll ever be. Let's get flipping between Zooms and my little cue cards here. We're going to start with Big Blue Stem. Lover of sunshine and growing 6 to 8 feet tall in open environments where they maintain highly flammable fuel beds that promote the frequent natural burns that keep their neighborhood fire prone. Water, with roots growing 20 feet deep, they don't mind the aridity of frequently burned environments. All right, Catherine, Roxanne, what do you think?
I'm going to say prairie.
Okay, one
I
for
guess.
prairie, one for prairie.
I would agree with prairie.
We've got 2 for prairie. Let's see where we're at. Oh, prairie, there it is. Chug a
Ding,
lug,
ding, ding,
ladies.
ding, ding,
All
ding.
right.
Chug a lug.
Ooh, one right.
Fantastic, fantastic. All right, moving right along to Jack Pine. Another fan of Casey and the Full Sunshine Band. Jack Pine has cones that only open after heat exposure, a thick, heat-resistant bark, and tiny seeds that only germinate on bare mineral soil, which allows for quick colonization after fires. Jack Pine youngsters seem perfectly adapted for some hot stuff, baby, this season. Catherine, Roxanne, what do you think? Where would you find Jack Pine on the forest progression map?
I'm going with, ooh, it's a tough one. I'm torn between 2 spots. I'm going to go with young forest.
Okay, right, one for young forest.
And I would say that you would be right. It depends if you're talking about the young tree or the old tree, right?
Right.
Very true.
So
Very
if
true.
I guess can I throw in a question while we're here?
Absolutely.
So if we have a forest of jack pine and there's never a fire, will they eventually just die off and we'll never have another jack pine?
Succession would happen. So most of the places where jack pine are pretty xeric sites in of themselves. They're on low quality soils. So you're never really going to go to like full closed canopy, dark, wet forests per se, but you would get oaks kind of coming in and kind of closing out that canopy and changing the environment. Yes.
So no more jack pine. Good thing we have fires.
Yeah.
Now I get why you don't like smoky.
There you go. There you go.
Good question, Roxanne, by the way. Moving right along to the Carner blue butterfly. Like others cheered on by Go Blue Chance, the Carner blue is a delicate and sensitive butterfly. Whew. Listed as federally endangered because the open understory is dominated by wildflowers have largely disappeared, taking the wild blue lupine legume that their caterpillars require with them. If only their kiddo-pillars weren't such picky eaters.
I'll let Catherine answer this one.
Yeah, prairie or savanna, somewhere in that. Right?
Ding, 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 ding.
Hey, hey.
Actual ecological niche, savanna. Well done, well done. Next up, the Kirtland's warbler. This species is quite the free bird of conservation success stories. Michigan's forests sure have changed, but this bird you cannot change. Nesting under short jack pines and needing grassy openings for foraging, they're as free as a bird now after their recent delisting from the endangered species list. Groupies across the Great Lakes have restored their habitat well, thanks in part to the use of prescribed fire.
I'm gonna go with prairie again.
Oh, prairie.
I'm
Very
thinking of
interesting.
open grasses, or it could be a savanna.
So
You were
I would
close.
say that you are correct in that they need open herbaceous areas to forage in, but they do require those young jack pine trees. And so that matrix of young forest right next to prairie is very important.
Okay.
Andy,
Would that be a savanna then?
No, because there are not the large overstory trees kind of mixed in, you know? It's a very intense hot fire that basically creates a new cohort of jack pine that are all kind of the same age after that fire growing up.
Got it.
Andy, just out of curiosity, there is just for the entertainment and educational purposes of the folks at home and all of ourselves, there is an age or a height after which Kirtland's warbler no longer will nest in those trees, correct? If I remember correctly, it's about, I want to say 15 or so years.
Yeah, I think that's about right.
Perfect.
You with correcting that, but no, that's a fine answer.
Fair enough.
Years, yep, they are gone. And that's part of the conservation success story of Kirtland's warbler, is that they've been able to adapt management around that and to basically shift those age classes of jack pine across the landscape and grow them up and harvest them and get some economic benefit out of that resource to then fuel the plantings and the continued maintenance of the age class that they require on the landscape.
The more you know.
The more you know.
Haha. The northern Bob white quail is a big fan of grassy areas, but thinks wildflowers and happy little shrubs are groovy too. Their palate needs are diverse, foraging in open grasslands, eating wildflower seeds, nesting in the warm embrace of big blue stem, and needing low-growing happy little shrubs to escape cover nearby because, well, they're basically a walking chicken nugget.
I would like to, before you provide an answer here, just say that me and Lee collaborated on these descriptions, and but the Bob Ross thing was all him, and it's just perfect.
Comedy gold.
Thank you.
I'm gonna go with Savannah, maybe.
One for Savannah. Excellent. Roxanne.
I would go with prairie.
All right.
Yeah, so I think you're both on the right track. So the crazy thing about bob whites is they really need it all, right? So at different life cycles, they need that thick woody escape cover to get away from them. Predators, because they are walking chicken nuggets. They need these open herbaceous areas to forage in. And their chicks are little fluff balls about the size of a ping pong ball that just really cannot get through thick vegetation. So they really need that open interstitial space underneath those clump grasses like big blue stem to really move around. So depending on the life stage and where they're whether they're nesting or feeding, they're going to need a huge variety. So there's a reason why northern bobwhites have declined precipitously in the eastern United States, and that is because maintaining that variety required fire and disturbance to have all of that kind of in close proximity so they can have a home range that contains it all.
All right. Haha, the ovenbird. Don't let the name fool you. The ovenbird likes cool, damp, closed canopy understories where they search leaf litter for tasty insect morsels. They also prefer to nest in leaf litter. To them, leaf litter is just the best, especially when it's moist and dark under a thick and full tree canopy, which promotes the accumulation of, you guessed it, leaf litter.
That one I get. Closed canopy forest.
Ding, 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 ding.
Excellent job. The prairie warbler. Not altogether unlike their cousin, the Kirtland warbler, the prairie warbler prefers dense thickets of tree regeneration under an open sky, which ain't exactly prairie. A nearby patch of wildflowers and grasses is nice, but not too far from a dense thicket, or they are gone like the prairies of old.
I'm gonna guess open woodland.
All right, one for open woodland. Roxanne?
I would say the same thing, open woodland.
All right, let's see where we land. Pretty close, pretty close. They're
Yes,
right
they
there.
need
They're right there.
that thick, nasty stuff that you don't want to go through.
Raspberries.
And I know because I did research on prairie warblers. It's not fun.
Andy's got the inside track. All right. Redback salamander. Changing things up from the birds and the bugs, the redback salamander likes it moist and where the sun don't shine, like the floor in a closed canopy forest. They can sometimes stick around in open environments if there's enough coarse woody debris, but if the spot's too dry, then it won't fly. Or crawl, for that matter. What do you think, ladies?
I'm going with closed canopy forest again.
All right.
Yep,
very
I've got to
nice, very
agree.
nice. All right,
Ding, ding,
fantastic.
ding.
There she is.
And they like to be under the fallen trees, don't they, in that super moist area?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Among other places.
Yeah.
Red-headed woodpecker. While distant cousin Woody was known for his laugh, the red-headed woodpecker is well known for its graceful air sallying, a fancy term for perching on old dead trees and taking short flights to catch insects midair. This requires open canopy structure and, of course, the dead trees they nest in, although sometimes they'll settle for the siding of your house, or mine, in the morning at 6 o'clock when I'm trying to sleep. Ladies, what do you think?
Open woodland, maybe?
I'm going
Good
with
guess,
young
good
forest.
guess. Fantastic.
Man.
We won't say who's right and who's wrong, but everyone sees it. So it's
I
recorded
think-
for all of posterity.
I think it's fair to say that Roxanne snagged it with Young Forest.
I
Tree
cheated and looked at the
pun.
drawing and saw the dead tree.
There you go.
Gave it away.
Sugar maple. A Michigan staple and source of delicious pancake sauce, the sugar maple calls the deep, dark, and moisture-rich depths of closed canopy forests home. They need light, but not a lot, and prefer moist soils between their roots. Any thoughts, ladies?
I think open woodland.
All right. All right.
Yeah,
Catherine?
let's go with that. Let's go with that. Yeah, this time.
Survey says closed canopy forest.
They like it dark and they like it wet.
Trillium. Unlike most of their colorful woodland friends, Trillium reside in the deep, dark recesses of the forest. But they don't get lonely, as Trillium often carpet the understory of closed canopy forests and make use of the ephemeral light early in the spring before the trees leaf out. They're something of an overachiever.
I'm going to say closed canopy forest.
I would agree.
I feel like you're on the right track. There it is. Fantastic. And finally, the white oak. Considered the Goldilocks of trees, white oak like some sun and semi-dry environments, but they don't showboat and prefer to put most of their energy into growing large roots beneath the soil. While this makes it difficult to compete with their more aggressive tree neighbors, like the sugar maple, in a way, their strategy of roots before shoots leaves them in a better position to resprout after a fire when one eventually comes. What do you think?
All right, third time's the charm. Open woodland.
Oh.
She did it.
Ta-da!
All right.
Fantastic. All right, you both did
Yes.
extraordinarily well. Everybody, let's give them a round, not of applause, but of another drink.
That's right. And there were no points, so there are no winners. But
They made it to be a point to be fantastic contestants, I will say.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
yes. Well, cool. So I hope this image here illustrates how, we built up to this point where we've kind of gotten an understanding of how fire can insert a variety of different structures and compositions of our forests onto Michigan's landscape, and have all of these species that associate with each one of those different places along this gradient. And so you can see how this spans a wide variety of different places and species. However, we know that our good friend Smokey the Bear came and ruined everything. And so what I'm about to show you is a little animation that will illustrate just the extent to which his errors were. So as we move forward in time, trees started growing, things grew up, and as we said, immediately we no longer have these young jack pines, they're growing up, and so our Kirtland warbler was lost. It became an endangered species, and so we had to start working on that. Things grow up again, more, get thicker. We've got more trees growing up in the understory and other species. Now, species don't immediately just disappear. Sometimes they move. So what once was prairie is now young forest. So we've got our prairie warbler kind of hopping around the landscape. Still here, but not where it used to be. Things become even thicker, growing even more. And again, we're losing more of those species, growing more. Our open woodland is now basically where savannas once were, maybe, if we can call it that. And eventually, closed canopy forest dominates the entire landscape because we've removed that source of variation, the fires that once maintained those other points. Remember that we're getting enough water to support closed canopy forests. Now, this isn't entirely true, across the board. We do have some differences in soils that might maintain some places as a little more dry, and the succession was slower there. But for the most part, without fire, a lot of these places became closed canopy forests, and all we're left with are our 4 species that were there. That's kind of sad. However, if we identify fire as the cause, the disappearance of fire as the cause of those negative trends. And Smokey the Bear, don't forget to blame him. We can simply return fire to our forested systems and do a lot of good. So some combination of management, maybe we need to accelerate things and do some thinnings first, use some chemical treatments, but then insert fire and we have our solution. We can, get back to where we want to go in restoring that diversity. The problem becomes when most people say, all right, let's just set it on fire. This is the image that they come up with in their head. Extreme wildfires. And I'm here to say that what we actually do is prescribe fire. And prescribed fire is fire ignited under predetermined weather and forest conditions to accomplish specific management objectives. We can also let natural fires burn as long as they fit into a prescription that we set beforehand. And this involves a whole lot of pre-planning and details and understanding how fire and weather and vegetation, fuels all interact. And it's a science. It's what I do, and it's what a lot of other managers do. I study it. Managers actually employ it and apply it. And so it's just done with a lot of preparation, a lot of resources and stuff goes into this. So it's not that image that you see up above, but rather it's done in a very specific fashion. So one way I want to illustrate this to you is the strip head ignition technique. And so basically what you would do is if the wind is coming in this direction indicated here, we can burn from the opposite side. This creates what's called a backing fire that just slowly backs into that wind and is very easy to control. And then we can set a strip in front of that would send a head fire that moves with the wind and becomes very intense, but then collides with that backing fire and all of that area that is already burned and then goes out. And if we apply those strips in very tight succession, we can control the intensity of the fire and do it in a very controlled fashion. So yeah, just one way to illustrate how we carry out these burns safely.
Believe it or not, playing with fire can actually be done extraordinarily responsibly and to great ecological benefit.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lee. Yes, yes. So if we do that to our forested systems here in Michigan, you can see that as we start to restore the disturbance, we're setting back that clock, we're moving things, we're starting to kill off some trees, we're restoring some of those open areas, and getting young forests with some more intense burns, less intense burns. We're maintaining the overstory and kind of opening up that understory to get back to a woodland type situation. And eventually we can get to the point where we restore all of that diversity back onto the landscape. And so I think that that's a really cool thing to realize. And so that's the story in the Eastern United States. But there's a more familiar story, and I think that's something that a lot of you are probably seen in the news, and that's that Western wildfires are increasing in frequency, size, and severity. So they're getting more common, they're getting bigger, and they're burning so intense and so hot that they're just killing everything. And so we can see that in this graph here. Is this the number of large fires? So fires that are greater than 1,000 acres for every year. And we're just, ramping that up almost exponentially. And I would be remiss to not mention the Camp Fire, which is probably on a lot of people's mind. It killed 85 people, destroyed almost 14,000 homes and burned over 153,000 acres. And then we could also kind of move into Australia and bring that into this equation, because that's a very similar environment. And so the Camp Fire actually, if it's like, oh, well, it's a forest fire, that's a California thing, but this fire moved 1 football field per second at its peak. And so I think that that's just a very scary thing to think about. And so really what this increase in Western wildfires and their frequency, size, and severity boils down to for society is 2 different things. A lot of money. We get a lot of structures lost. That's a lot of money, a lot of people's homes, a lot of people's businesses. but it's also insurance money and things that go like that. And then also the money that we spend to stop those fires. So, here's graphics of that. The U.S. Forest Service is what's ponying up the large portion of that bill every year. There is also some contributions in the Department of Interior or Bureau of Land Management that you can see there in the orange. And every year since 1994, only one has been less than $1 billion in costs for the United States. But it's also lives lost. So civilians, there's actually no really good tracking of civilian deaths related to wildfires. But here's some data from California on state responsibility lands alone. And you can see that increase from the 1970s to current. But we do have really good numbers on wildland fire fatalities. And these are the people that we send out to stop these fires. And we see that increase. It's kind of stable, it's leveled off recently, but it's still around 20 people dying every single year from fighting these wildfires. And then if we want to talk about out west, are there these ecological benefits from these megafires that are currently occurring? And the answer is unequivocally, nope. Because, and I would point you to this really cool TED Talk by Paul Hesburgh that you can get here at this link. And specifically these time periods in that longer video, in that TED Talk. And really what he boils it down to is that historically, these fires were so different. They were very low intensity and they maintained these open, sparsely treed environments that had fuels that created low intensity fires that would burn through. And so from that, you can see these fuel bed depiction here. You can see that you're not killing the stuff that is underground, and you have this nice open park-like environment. But what we've done today, because of Smokey the Bear, and we've eliminated for fire for so long, we have these massive fuel beds and an epidemic of trees that is creating the megafires that we see today that absolutely sterilize the soil and do a lot of ecological damage. So my whole preceding argument about the benefits of fire in the Eastern United States kind of falls apart in the Western United States when we dive into the current epidemic of trees. So what can we do to really change the Western fire story and what's really driving it? Well, the first thing I'd point to is this triangle. We have the fire triangle. A lot of you are probably familiar with heat, fuel, and an ignition oxygen as what is required to make fire. But if we talk about megafires, we can talk about humans, fuels, and climate. And that interaction is really driving these huge fires. And so when we talk about humans, what we're really talking about is the increase in the wildland urban interface. So we have rapid growth of houses and structures being situated in areas prone to fire. And then we feel like we have to put out the fires to protect those structures. And that just makes future fires worse because we're accumulating fuels. And also the climate is changing, right? So we're getting warmer and drier and longer fire seasons that are also contributing to this problem. Next, we have something called the fire suppression paradox. And really, this is this idea that of all the wildfires that occur in the United States, 98% of them are immediately suppressed. Thank you, Smokey the Bear, doing your job. We are going to attack every fire as it occurs. But that leaves 2% of the fires that we don't contain. And those 2% actually result in 97% of the total costs and area burned from wildfire every year. And that's because by putting out every fire, we create the megafires that are only the 2% of the number of fires, but are the ones that are actually burning the most amount of land and causing the most amount of problem. Also, the fifth point here is capacity. So we have this paramilitary type organization that is really, increased in terms of technology and ability to deploy aircraft and all of these, these highly specialized and trained smoke jumpers that jump out of planes and put out all the fires. And so it's basically this idea that if we have it, we'll deploy it and we'll put out every fire. So capacity has really contributed to the problem. We also have what's called the process predicament or analysis paralysis. And basically this is the idea that if a wildfire occurs, we go and we put it out. But things like preventative management or fuel reduction treatments that occur within our forests that would be thinning them out or restoring what was historically there, these more open woodland type environments, requires a whole lot of paperwork. So here's preventative management buried in that paperwork. And so that's really causing a barrier to change. And then also we can talk about goal ambiguity. It's really hard for fire managers to recognize it as a benefit to a resource, as we initially started to talk about, and also a threat. And where do we fall in addressing fire, and where do we put priorities? It creates a lot of conflict. There's also a lot of entrenched incentives. One example would be the way in which budgets are structured. So every year, the forests across the U.S. forest system get an allocation of money, but then a ton of that money is actually stolen and goes out west to fight wildfires. And so, that kind of creates this incentive to maintain that system, because it's like, hey, every year we get this influx of funds to continue to do what we do. And so why would we change that? And then finally, the last point I'll make on this is a lack of public pressure. So all of y'all are probably siding with Smokey the Bear, and here he is smoking a cigarette while watching the forest burn. So, maybe just something to think about, that if we had more public pressure pointed towards these agencies, they might do something to change the problem.
Andy, I'd say it's worth pointing out that Smokey the Bear was a phenomenal marketing technique, and that it got the point across very well, but not necessarily a point that should have been made for as long as it was. Especially with the detriment to what really happened.
Absolutely, yes. It was an extremely effective tool, and it was addressing a problem that we had at the time of extreme wildfires occurring after the extreme amount of cutting of our forest that was occurring, and all the slash that was left after that history across much of the Eastern United States. So it really was an important tool to get us out of that stage, but then it just kind of went a little too far. So very good point in backtracking a little bit to say that, Smokey did a lot of good as well. So this next little point was kind of the, where a lot of the course that Lee was in kind of headed. And so I thought that it'd be a really good thing for him to kind of try to walk us through this coupled socio-ecological system. Now that's another $5 word. Go ahead, Lee.
So what we're basically looking at is, again, the coupled socio-ecological system, and where we find ourselves right now is in this period where from fire, our current perspective is that fire equates to a loss of life, property suppression, costs, and health impacts. And into it, we pour policy planning and management to a great degree of money. But a larger, view of such a thing what we don't really have is a whole lot of focus on the ecological benefit of using fire the way fire would theoretically be used on a natural course, and emulating what fire would do in nature if we allowed it to do so. So our desired perspective should really be something more along the lines of the values that it gets, the driving of ecological distribution and diversity and landscapes and species diversity and all of these things, and the impact that it has in that regard.
Yeah, so I mean, to wrap this up, I mean, just the idea is that suppressing every fire is dangerous, expensive, and harmful. And I think so my decree here in Science After Dark is that henceforth Pyro Possum shall replace Smokey in all his duties, and we can move forward into a new future where we recognize the true role that fire has in our world, and we can start to try to live with it instead of fight against it. That's a joke. I do not think that we should get away with, do away with Smokey. I think he does a lot of good, but Pyropossum, maybe he has a place. So lastly, to wrap this up, just want to talk about in the future. So we know from a lot of different sources of evidence that climate-driven increases in wildfire will soon occur. This is a result of increasing temperatures, the increasing rate of evapotranspiration. So trees are going to start moving more moisture out of these systems and drying the environments because of that increase in temperature. That's what this evapotranspiration means. There will be greater in frequency and length of droughts. We'll have more lightning causing fires. We'll have greater wind speeds moving that fire across the landscape. And we'll have this alteration in spring snow melts that'll dry out environments earlier than we've ever seen. And all of this is going to result in a longer fire season. 19% is estimated as an increase globally. And if you combine all this with a positive feedback in that every time a fire occurs, it's releasing more carbon into the atmosphere and contributing more to global warming, you have a pretty devastating impact. So what I want to try to explain is that when we talk about climate, is it in just a shift in the mean? So what this represents is a distribution about a variable. So let's say this is temperature. We have this mean, and then we have, temperatures that are on the low side and the high side, but there's this mean. And in the future, we're going to shift that mean over, but what we're also going to do is increase the amount of variability. So we're going to flatten the curve. I bet you've heard that lately. So that's what the future looks like. And what this really means in terms of our climatic variability in any one of these variables is that what once was extreme events, this down here, in this gray, the light gray portion, will become a whole lot more common. And what once was never happened is going to start happening a lot. So novel events. And if we put that in terms of fire, Western wildfires are going to be just continue to get worse and worse and worse. But I would want to transition back to how we began this with the Eastern United States and leave you with this, that, here are our forests of today. They are becoming darker and wetter, and the species composition is changing. And we can imagine a future where we do nothing to prepare for what we know is coming, or a future where we use management as a tool to kind of prepare our forests for the future that's coming. So in that first scenario, without management, we do nothing, the forests get darker and wetter and become completely dominated by fire-sensitive, shade-loving tree species. And then we go into a period of time where fires will be much more common, and they will rip through these forests, and all of those fire-sensitive trees are going to die. We will probably have some remnant oak regeneration or fire-tolerant trees that can kind of poke through and maybe reestablish themselves and equilibrate to a nice forest in the future, but there will be this very harsh adjustment period. And so that is a very degraded forest in the future. However, if we manage our forests with fire and get back to what we were headed for in that game, and we use fire actively on the landscape, we can maintain this kind of open, these open environments with regeneration from these species that can tolerate fire, so that then when that future of more fire and more frequent fire comes, we have this resilient forest that exists and provides us with all the ecosystem services that forests provide, and can be maintained into the future. And you might be saying, oh, Andy, that is just far-fetched. This is not an Eastern problem, it's a Western problem. Well, I will tell you about a little day in November while I was finishing up my PhD in Tennessee, where 14 people died and 134 people were injured in a wildfire that happened in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, came out of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a national park known for salamanders, a national park known for rhododendrons, a national park known for its waterfalls and just extremely wet environment. And so I think that, this is a reality that is closer than further away. So in conclusion, in wildland fire, we have a term called mop-up. Mop-up really means going in after a burn and making sure all the hot spots are out, make sure with, high detail, being like, oh, there's a little smoky patch here, put some water on that, make sure the fire is completely out. We call that mop-up. And so that's what I'm going to do here with conclusions. We can transition these dark, wet environments to a lush understory of grasses and wildflowers and a more open environment and benefit a lot of species. So this really is mesophication in reverse. And when we do that, we can increase the diversity, the function, the sustainability, and resilience of our forests. And really what we're doing is burning forests to save forests, as the title indicated. So in conclusion, we'd be doing mop-up like this guy right here. So I did want to leave you with one little last nugget. If any of this sparked your interest, like it did my daughter here, she really loves fires, and I'm just so proud of her because, yeah, she just gets really excited every time we start a fire. But for more information, I'd really like you to check out the resources the Michigan DNR has. They have a really cool story map that you can find on the line. The Michigan Prescribed Fire Council is actually this coalition of all these crazy pyromaniacs like me and Lee that gets together and talks about these issues. Also, the Joint Fire Science Program is a federal program that tries to link science with managers and resources and try to increase the communication of fire science across the United States. And Michigan is actually covered by two regions, the Lake States Fire Science Consortium and the Tall Grass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium. You can see those regions depicted there. Also know that there's a ton of career opportunities in fire with federal and state agencies. You can do research, you can manage for wildlife, you could urban planning, get into policy, just a whole bunch of stuff. You could take courses online through the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, and that link is provided there. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our great Department of Forestry at the Michigan State University. You can take an intro to wildland fire course that'll get you the base level certification for what you need to be a wildland firefighter. And then you can take my course and actually know how to light things on fire like these brave souls did this past fall.
Responsibly, I might add.
Responsibly and without after dark drinks. So yeah, with that, I don't know. I know we at the 104 mark, so.
Yeah, we're a little short of time, but there was one question I wanted to raise. Bob wanted to know, are there any courses that teach controlled burning for the layperson, which you covered online, but do you know of any in-person courses?
Yeah, so, I mean, my course, our courses at Michigan State are in person normally, outside of the effects of COVID-19 and things like that. And if there is this serious consideration of a career switch or going back to school, or you're in, just in that age group where you're considering the program, yes. But outside of that, I do know that, there is S130, S190 trainings, which is the base level certification in wildland firefighting that you can get. And those opportunities would be posted through the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council's website. And I think that'd be a really good resource to pay attention to if you were, wanted to get that type of training. And then, advancing from that, there's the NWCG courses that are more advanced. So beyond the S130, 190 that you could take.
Great. Well, thank you. This was really an interesting talk. I enjoyed it. So we thank you, Lee and Andy, for your time tonight. And we have Saturday morning science. We can learn what blood typing means, and you can do a hands-on demo with that. And Catherine, did you have anything else?
No, I just want to thank you both for joining us tonight. And yeah, like Roxanne said, for everyone tuning in, we have a couple more programs coming up online. Saturday morning science starting at 11 a.m. So I hope you join us.
Awesome.
Yep.
Fantastic.
All right.
Thank you very much for having us.
thank you to all the first responders and healthcare professionals keeping us safe. Stay home, stay safe, stay healthy.
Excellent.
Couldn't agree more.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.